Hi. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Gean Moreno. I'm the director of the Art and Research Center at ICA Miami. We have a great panel on Richard, and I'm so excited to share the stage with some luminary panelists. I'm going to introduce them from left to right. So beside me is Dr. Louise Bernard, who is Senior Vice President of the Obama Foundation and the founding director of the Obama Presidential Center. She previously served as Director of Exhibitions at the New York Public Library, as Curator of Prose and Drama at the Yale Collection of American Literature, at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, and as Assistant Professor at Georgetown University. She received a BA with honors in drama from the University of Manchester, an MA in theater history, and an MA in English literature from Indiana University Bloomington, and a PhD in African American Studies and American Studies from Yale. Her research engages with the literary archive, material culture, museology, public history, and interpretive planning and design. She currently serves on the board of directors for the Lyric Opera in Chicago and on the advisory council for the Johnson Publishing Company archive. On the other side of our stage, John Ott is the executive director and founding member of the Richard Hunt Legacy Foundation. He was a close friend of the artist and is Richard Hunt's official biographer. Over the past several decades, John has spent countless hours with Hunt in his studios and on the road, traveling to see art and visit friends. For the artist monograph Richard Hunt 2022, John interviewed Hunt for over 100 hours, producing a comprehensive illustrated chronology of the artist's life. He has lectured often on Hunt's life and work, and recently authored the essay, Richard Hunt, Sculpting Freedom. He has also served as an advisor in multiple exhibitions dedicated to the work of Richard Hunt, and I can testify to this without any doubt. He's a tireless advocate for the work and legacy of Richard Hunt. And then at the far end, Eric W. Stephenson is a fifth-generation sculptor. He earned a BFA from Pennsylvania State University and an MFA from the University of Houston. He has taught at institutions such as the Rhode Island College and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and has exhibited his work widely. He began working with Richard Hunt in 2001 as a head welder, and eventually became studio director and project manager. At Hunt's passing, he took on the role of a special art trustee. Currently, he's steering the winding down of Hunt's studio while completing his last commission, a memorial to Emmett Till. So I thought we would begin at the end, which maybe is a way to thinking about the beginning. And so Richard Hunt had multiple high points in his career. And I think an early one was a retrospective when he was just 35 years old in 1971 at MoMA. So I'm going to call that the front bookend of his life and career. And if that's true, I think that maybe the back bookend while he was still alive was the commission for the Obama Presidential Center. So I would love to hear Louise say something about why it was so important not only to bring Richard Hunt into the picture, but why it was important to have him first and maybe set a tone. And I give you the word.
Okay, thank you, Gean. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for braving the rain. Feels very English, very at home. And I would just like to say thank you to all at ICA, to Gean and the wonderful team, to John, to Eric for being here, to my colleagues at the Obama Foundation, including Virginia Shaw, who's our curator of commissions, worked very closely with Richard and with Eric in terms of selecting Richard for a commission at the Obama Presidential Center, and to the wonderful team at Y-Cube, who now really shepherd the estate and the legacy of Richard Hunt. And I would say, Gean, it's wonderful to see a survey of Richard's work, which is really kind of in the round, and you see a survey at a glance, so to speak. You're able to take in the works as they're literally in dialogue with each other across time, which I think is remarkable. But to the commission, the Obama Presidential Center, this is a presidential center that we're building from the ground up on the south side of Chicago. We're slated to open in 2026. It is a presidential center unlike any other. And I think one of the key differences is the importance of art. Many of you may be aware that art was so important to President and Mrs. Obama during their time in the White House. And so this is kind of a living legacy of that work and that commitment to the importance of artists who help us to really imagine and shape the world in which we live. This is a world as it is and the world as it ought to be. And so we look to artists like Richard Hunt, who are truly visionaries, both in and beyond his time, so to speak. There's a timelessness, obviously, to Richard's work. But it was important for us to engage with Richard as a luminary figure in Chicago. But importantly now, as we think about the estate, he's an artist whose work many people are just discovering for the first time, which I think is remarkable to both John and Eric and others. But we wanted to think about Richard's place in Chicago. He was born on the South Side in Woodlawn, raised in Englewood, educated at the School of the Art Institute. And really his career is played out against the backdrop of this remarkable city. It's important also to note that the commissioned piece is site-specific. We can say more about its kind of birth. It began as an award for the United Negro College Fund, but is now a piece at 8-foot scale. It's a bird emerging out of a book, and we can talk more about that motif in Richard's work throughout his career. But it is in the courtyard of a public library. We have a public library, a branch of the Chicago Public Library, at the heart of the center itself on this 19.3-acre campus. And Richard's mother, and I believe his sister as well, were both librarians in the Chicago Public Library system. So there are layers of meaning there embedded in why we would engage an artist like Richard Hunt. We have over 25 commissions, and so again, they're all in conversation with each other. But I think that is one of kind of the grounding aspects of thinking about Richard's career and its meaning in Chicago and beyond. And I'll just close by saying that the Obama Foundation is rooted on the south side of Chicago in terms of its kind of home base and the presence of the Obama Presidential Center. But it has a national story. It's the story of the nation's 44th president, the first Black president, the first Black family in the White House. And it has a global reach. And we think about President Obama's cosmopolitan worldview and upbringing. And I think that also is very resonant in Richard's work and bearing. So I'll stop there.
Okay. I think, so Chicago is really interesting, thinking of Miami as a place that marks American histories that are maybe not the art world histories. So we think of very central places like New York and currently LA as the art center, but American history actually has many centers. And I think Chicago, if you think of the Great Migration and these things, it's quite central, the way Miami is for waves of immigrants from Central America. And it's just the texture of America has to do with these cities that are not maybe the central art cities. So I don't know. I maybe, John, you can jump in here about Richard's commitment to Chicago, to the histories of Chicago. And yeah,
sure. And thank you again for hosting this event, and White Cube and ICA Miami. It's just been fabulous to see the show to come together, and really the appreciation and the understanding and the broadening of the aperture into Richard's world, which is so very important to art history in this country and beyond, and the movement, and that's made possible by events like this. So thank you so much. You know, just continuing on the themes that Louise was talking about, there's so many through lines with Bookbird. And, you know, you mentioned his mother and sister were a librarian. And I think about the free Chicago Public Library system. And his mother was one of the very first African-American women who was a librarian. She was preceded by Vivian Harsh and a few others, but she was, foundational to, changing what libraries look like in the city of Chicago. But this idea of infrastructure of a city being built for free is so important to who Richard became. He was taken by his parents to the free museums, which was, the Field Museum and the Art Institute of Chicago, and these massive institutions, world-class institutions being free to everyone and open to the public, meant that his parents, who one had grown up a sharecropper and the other on a farm in central Illinois, had come together, got married, had Richard, and they were what Richard described as strivers. So they took every opportunity afforded to them. And so the free public transportation, free museums. And then, of course, Richard ended up going to school at the School of the Art Institute for college. He had been going since he was 13 years old at the junior school, but ended up going because of a Chicago Public School Society scholarship. So this idea of what happens when a country and a community invest in the public infrastructure, I think, is something that is very prescient to the decisions that are being made today. So that's another through line. But of course, the symbolism of the piece itself, this bird emerging from the book. And I had this conversation in one of our first conversations that I had with Louise. In a way, it's an atypical piece because it's more representative than most of the things you would associate with Richard Hunt. And another way, it could be his icon or it could be his emblem because it literally is who Richard was. It captures exactly his spirit, which is this idea of freedom emerging from education. But that trajectory wasn't just an earthly one. This idea of ascension and freedom and even the bird moving was this connection with heaven and ascension and the tie back to the spirituality of what it means for a bird to fly, to soar, to get closer to heaven, what it means to go to the north, to the Great Migration. All of these things, occur as, they're very recurrent themes throughout his life. And then, of course, just the connection to the Obamas. His father was trustee of the AME Church in Inglewood, but before that was going to the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Woodlawn, which is the same church that Michelle Obama's great-grandfather went to and her family grew up going to. And she had people that went to the junior school of the Art Institute in Michelle Obama's family with Richard. So you have this, very rooted in Chicago, and Chicago being important not just as a destination of the Great Migration, but also the steel. And this is one thing that, is important to highlight is that, Chicago had the world's first skyscraper. This is where all of the steel industry was along Lake Michigan. And so Richard doing these pieces need to be seen in the context of, what Richard would describe as, Michelangelo would go out and use marble because they were building bridges out of marble. And he used steel and iron because that's what they were building the buildings that he saw outside. And he was, working in his father's barbershop, sweeping up the hair of the steel mill workers and hearing their stories and what they were doing to literally create a city. So it wasn't just fleeing the, South and Jim Crow. It was getting together and actually creating a future in Chicago, literally out of the materials of the industrial age. And that context, I think, adds additional layers to the work as well.
Yeah, I would just add, it is kind of the city as a crucible, this forge out of which culture has been made. And I think Richard was just so central to that. He was also a very bookish person as well. The show at the Loyola University, the Luma show, had a lovely selection of Richard's books. And again, this idea of the flight of creativity and the imagination and this forward propulsion, which I think we see in so many of Richard's works, is that kinetic energy to the idea of the imagination. And that is so embedded in this piece.
And another through line is this, connection with presidents. And, Richard, who had, gone to the Southside Community Art Center, famous on the south side of Chicago, opened by Eleanor Roosevelt, and he attended that when he was young. But then, Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1968, bringing him on the National Council of the Arts, the governing body of the NEA, to take the place of David Smith, who had just passed away. And he was just the fourth African-American and the first African-American visual artist after people like Marian Anderson, the contralto singer, or Ralph Ellison, the novelist. And so he had had a presence at the presidency even then. The show you just mentioned that was at Loyola was organized by the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, the first real fine art exhibition that that presidential library mounted, getting ready for another installation in another presidential library. And then one of the interesting things, I found a letter in Richard's archive that he wrote to Nixon, saying, thank you for giving this speech on supporting the arts. And it was really under the Nixon administration that the NEA was funded. Politics have changed a little bit in the last half century. But, it was, Richard said in that letter, and I'm willing to contribute whatever I can. And of course, the NEA took him up on that. And he did commissions that were funded through the National Council and went on. And that was really part of his ability to change the landscape of public monuments in this country, comes from those relationships as well.
Yeah, and can I add one other thing? But I was just really surprised to learn recently that Richard had sat on the jury for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which was awarded to Maya Lin. She was still an undergraduate at Yale at the time, but Maya now has a wonderful piece, or will have a wonderful piece, at the Obama Presidential Center. So again, these commissions speaking to each other. But again, Richard was the only Black American on that jury.
And the youngest. He really represented the next generation. Yeah. And, they had landscape architects, they had a few sculptors. But these were seen as the luminaries and recognized in D.C. And one interesting piece about this sculpture, you mentioned the United Negro College Fund, and Richard was such a fundamental part of that organization and had for many years. His second wife, Lenora Cartwright, actually encouraged Richard to do this Bookbird sculpture for their award. And that award, even though we're now, it's 8 feet tall at the Obama Presidential Center, will be soon, that award was actually given to George Bush Senior in 1989 as a token of appreciation from the United Negro College Fund by their CEO for the support that he had given to the UNCF.
So I think so many pathways just opened up, which I think is what Richard's work is about. We talked about ascension, maybe the cosmological some ways. Then we also talked about social reality, social justice. So I think one of the, what I would say, poetic justice for the Obama commission is that what in some ways is the most figurative, I want to call it abstract in the sense that it's about general aspiration, right? It's about human aspiration. All of a sudden social reality comes in and we see, the defunding of public infrastructure, like you were saying, educational infrastructure, universities in these complex situations at the moment. So it's all of a sudden, the poetic justice is that social pressures come back into even the most literal, abstract sculptures. And I think this is really significant to understanding Richard Hunt, is this constant negotiation between forwarding the most advanced proposals in sculpture and in some way addressing or encoding social realities. Somehow the index of social realities is somehow in there. And the show's called Pressure because I think the works, particularly the very early works, seem to index a physical pressure, but there's also a social pressure, right? There's the kind of civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And I feel like, unlike other sculptors perhaps, he really had a sense that he had to encode these social realities and facts in the work. And I think the tension in the work is this dialectic between how do I make the most advanced sculpture I can make in the road to abstraction, modernist abstraction, and how am I true to the social realities of the American moment? So I don't know if that's a question, but that's a very loaded statement that anyone can totally run with.
Well, I think the exhibition gives the opportunity to see Richard's work in exactly the light you just suggested. And I think on first glance, it would be easy to see, the difference rather than the similarities among the groups of the clusters of the works upstairs. But if you take the example of just 3 pieces on that, first initial installation as you walk into the left of the works from the 50s. You can take just a small selection of those and extrapolate his entire career and see how much integrity there was to his initial vision. And the pieces that I would mention would be, one would be Wing Bloom, referencing biomorphic, avian, it looks plant-like, it's growing, it's ascending. That was the piece that Hilton Kramer picked in his review of the 1971 MoMA exhibition as being most illustrative of the Gonzalez's, drawing in space style that had so much influenced Richard in the 50s when he saw his work. And then another piece would be, of course, Emmett Till's homage, Hero's Head. And even with Hero's Head, he didn't name that piece Heroes. He didn't name that piece Emmett Till. There's no reference to Till. He extrapolated it out to really what could be seen as a statement of lynching in society and the state of, how important that was to the South Side of Chicago and to all Americans, but certainly African Americans, titling that piece Hero Head was very important. And that presaged the Hero series of sculpture, one of which is upstairs as well. And then the third piece would be telescopic construction, one of the very first pieces that he made. And that telescope, that radio, oh, there we go. We got them synced up. This is great. This is exactly, referential to the design of the types of 1950s radio telescopes that were just being used to see as far as you could possibly get. And it's easy to think about Richard's, interest in science and biology as a reference point, but there's a deeper meaning here. This was Richard in his sculpture capturing this connection to the heavens. Right. And so he saw this as the absolute outer limit of pushing sculptures to reference both, ascending and descending forms, Jacob's ladder, he'll over and over again, he'll repeat this theme. So you see, celebrating African Americans, the, biomorphism and zoological and anthropomorphic forms, and then, this connection to the heavens. And that goes through all the way to the very end of his career. So you see, it's a great exhibition to see all of his experimentation in the different phases of his work, but you can see the same mind working on these themes and then all these sculptures as variations that just keep unfolding through the decades.
Yeah, so I think also as we think of the sky, and we also think this is around the same time like Anthony Caro's making horizontal works, right? So there's this aspirational reading, and there's this very materialist reading in relation to modern sculpture. And I think this is where the tension and why the work continues to be vital. It's because it lands at that tension point. And I was thinking of Chicago as, so the modernism of New York is Ab X and is the outcrop of the surrealists who came during the war. The modernism of Chicago is Bauhaus. And you start looking at those tubular forms, those are kind of Mies van der Rohe chairs. So there's this kind of a really complicated engagement with modernism that maybe you could not have in New York. Maybe you need to be in Chicago or a place like Chicago to be able to engage. So I think this aspiration of looking at the cosmos, the counterweight to that is this very materialist looking at sculpture, looking at the most advanced sculpture and challenging it or being in the ring with it or something like this. So I think there's, I don't know, again, I have no questions. I just have these statements that I feel there's a lot to pry out. So please take it over.
Yeah, I find it interesting that in several of your comments, you talk about the advanced nature of Richard's work, and both visually and in technique. He was very rooted in traditional materials, working with the hammer, the anvils. The material he was using for most of these sculptures was literally dragged up off the streets, hundreds of pieces, thousands of different shapes and forms. But as we moved along through his career, and I was by Richard's side for so much of it over the last 20 years, and as we worked on different things, his scale and approach to materials obviously started to slow down a little bit on the tail end, especially as we were doing the Obama presentation. But the one thing I was able to bring to the table to help him was we started working with technology. You know, he had this fascination, as John said, about the sciences and maths and everything. So he was always equally interested in the different developments in technology and how we might be able to fold those new tools and techniques into the studio, one of which was actually playing in VR. And so one of the ways, you know, so the original trophy for UNCF is, you know, roughly 16 inches or so tall and stuff. And then when we realized, okay, we're going to make it for the OPC, how do we change that up in scale? So we wound up fabricating the book and over accentuating the leaves and bounding of the books to actually read as wings. So, you know, because we realized pretty quickly that imagery was simple enough that people were going to read it to a book unless we really just took it to a whole nother place. But by exaggerating it, more than it just being a static nest, it started that initial movement and that pushing of upflight for the bird. So it ultimately had that foundation to take off, hypothetically. But it was a great scene to be able to have Richard in you know, so I did originally a 3D scan of the original trophy and then have the headset on Richard and being able to, at least rudimentary, be able to move the tools and move the space as we, you know, exaggerated that form and made that sculpture its own, even though it came from the birthing from the maquette, but taking that technology to bring it to and create a whole new life for that object. And then ultimately that piece became a segue into the way we executed the memorial for IDB Wells.
Yeah, that's so interesting. We were talking about earlier about how many sketchbooks there are from the early decades and how they seem to dwindle. But there seems to be then others. I don't know. I guess the question is, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the day-to-day studio dynamics with Richard, because it does seem that it was very dynamic.
Right. I mean, on a daily basis, I mean, the reality is the guy made something every day for 70 years. And so he, you know, basically lived in a studio, at least in the time that I was working with him. And so I get there early morning and classical music would be playing and echoing off the glazed tile walls of his studio. But as soon as we came to the building, the music stopped. And there was a moment where I asked him, you know, why is that? You know, so many artists listen to music while they work, and he was afraid that us, you know, grinding and hammering away and stuff like that would bastardize the music or disrupt it and everything. So, but ultimately that music was always going on in his head. He didn't need to actively listen to it. But we'd roll in. He'd have it, you know, after, you know, sleeping. He would typically sleep from about 10 at night till about 1 in the morning, and then he'd get up and live with the sculptures from 1 until about 5 or 6 in the morning. Getting a sense of what he wanted us to do that next day. Then he'd take another nap for a couple of hours and then wake up around the time I came in, which is 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. And then we went to work. He was also an extremely avid reader. We picked up and he read through somewhere between 6 and 8 newspapers and different magazines every day. And so sometimes if he was caught up in an article, we'd be standing there waiting for the next thing. One of the key things about working with Richard is that the best analogy that comes to mind is we were more of a nurse-doctor relationship in the sense that where a lot of sculptors will turn to their assistants and give us a task, and then they walk away from the situation. We execute the task, and then the artist comes back. With Richard, we were assisting him. He was on the sculpture working with us. You know, so he'd give us a cardboard pattern. We cut it out and we'd pre-shape it, but then he would forge it the rest of the way, and then he would be right there as we stitched and worked up a seam, you know, blending these forms together, creating the piece at the moment during its creation. And so there was some sketching, but for the most part, he was literally sketching in space in real time as we were working on the pieces. And that sequence would just ebb and flow throughout the day. And some days would be 5 or 6 hours. Some days would be 20 or multiple days in a row. And, you know, even at 80 years old, he was pulling all-nighters to, you know, get pieces done for deadlines.
I was just going to say, Eric, do you want to say a little bit more about the studio space itself? It was just so remarkable. It felt like a foundry, but you knew it intimately.
Right.
Yeah, tell us where he slept for these naps, because that's
Yeah, so the studio in Lincoln Park is an old power substation, and it's where they would take the electrical power from AC power from the local AC grid to convert it to 600 volt DC, which is what ran originally the trolley line that ran up and down Lincoln Avenue from that area, which was considered the suburbs, to downtown Chicago, and then later also powered the elevated. But the building itself is essentially 500 by 100 feet, completely open. Has a heavy tiered 25-ton bridge crane that runs the length of the building, which is how we would pick up and move the sculptures. The inside of the sculpture, or the thing, that we have a beautiful set of windows, along the east wall. So the best light was always in the mornings. And even midday as it came down through the skylights. The walls are glazed tile. So in a lot of ways, it had this great resnick tone to the space, almost like an amphitheater, which accentuated all of our makings and grindings and hammerings to the. Well, some of the neighbors were okay with it. Some of the neighbors less so, especially at 3 a.m. But it was a magnificent open space. At times, over the years, there might be paths that were like deer paths. You go through. It was almost impossible to walk through the studio because he had so many pieces in process without getting to one side without ripping your pants or drawing blood. Although it's opening up now, we have quite a bit of space to walk around sculptures. But yeah, no, it's been a fantastic place to work for the last 20 years.
And so where the naps took place was actually a little plywood nook on the second floor. Have you seen Ghost Dog, the movie of the samurai who his life is just to be a samurai? It has a little bit. It's just a plywood block with a bed, a little TV, and if he had to go to the bathroom, he had to climb these ladder. It wasn't even stairs to go to it was a monkish.
Right. I would say. He always described it as his loft. Think more tree fort. As he said, you go into the bathroom, you climb up a ladder through a trap door, and the room, and actually didn't have a little TV up there. It was literally just a mattress on the floor, telephone, a notepad for scribing down ideas, the ashes of his late wife, Lenore Cartwright, and that was about it for the bedroom. But yeah, but his actually key place he would take naps was he would sit in his chair in the office. So.
And then, John, can you tell us a little bit about his African art collection?
Sure. Richard started his exposure to African art with the Benin bronzes that were at the Art Institute. And so from a very early age, he had this dual training in understanding and aesthetic, from Africa as well as European modernism and, looking at Picasso and Gonzalez. And so once he had become a successful sculptor in the 60s. That kind of coincided with traders coming from Africa through Chicago and bringing artifacts. And, museums were buyers, but they would always stop by Richard Hunt's studio. And this predates the space that Eric just described. This would be in the 1960s in Cleveland Avenue, which is a smaller studio space. But he started acquiring these pieces, and you can definitely see the impact on his work and how it relates to this concept of pressure, because you see in these early works of dining chairs that are legs and chair legs and table legs that are all twisted and they're chromed steel coming from the 60s. You can see how as he moves into the 70s, the influence of acquiring all these African forms, that same kind of tension and pressure is expressed, but the shapes look more like the throwing knives from West Africa, or this piece with the sword sticking out at the top and all of these angular elements. He started to express that kind of tension and edge in a different way. But I want to call back to one thing you mentioned about surrealism and Chicago and place and being rooted in that place. Chicago is a big city for surrealism, and the Art Institute and the collectors and a lot of the donors of that museum really embrace surrealism. And so Richard was surrounded by this and trained in surrealism, and he throughout his life didn't want to take anything that was too representational and put it in a work. He would pull these things more from his subconscious and from his dreams. And he wrote down his dreams, and in his archive are just these wonderful, lengthy papers that one day we'll get to read from the Getty Research Institute once they have all of that scanned, of his dreams. And in fact, he was on the board of the Psychotherapy Institute in Chicago for maybe a decade. So he really believed in this surrealist tradition, as well as the abstract tradition, as well as kind of carrying on the Julio Gonzalez, drawing in space concepts that then turned with his African art collection, representing kind of the second tier of how that progressed through his work in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, so let's go back to this, the theme of ascension, right? The cosmological that you brought up, and take it away.
Well, I would bring up a work that is right down the street from us here in Miami. There's a work called Ascending Descending Form. That's the centerpiece of the Joseph Caleb Community Center that was built in 1975. He installed the work in 1977. This work was installed the same year he did the monument for Martin Luther King Jr. I've been to the mountain in Memphis, just a few hundred yards away from where King was assassinated. The piece that he did in Miami was also for a figure, an African-American figure that was assassinated, and that was Joseph Caleb. Joseph Caleb in the 70s, in the 60s, became the head of the most important African-American union in the country. It was construction workers. It was 85% black, the second largest union in the country, and his power was met with an assassination from other union bosses, and it was a mob-style hit. It was in a parking lot in Miami in 1972, more than half a dozen gunshots, and Richard was asked to do the monument for this individual. And if you go just 3 miles down the road here in Miami, it's 20 feet hanging suspended from the ceiling. These architectural, very, very geometric kind of hanging from this, completely white ceiling, and then this very organic form that you see, articulating in a biomorphic way called ascending, descending form. And it's important to understand that work in the context, as you were talking about this connection to the heavens and spirituality. He did this the same year that he did the Martin Luther King monument, but also a very important monument called Jacob's Ladder, which is in the Carter G. Woodson Library in Chicago, which is all about the connection of the heavens and the earth. And so if you go to the Joseph Caleb Community Center, you'll see a massive monument with his likeness on the wall, or a mural with Joseph Caleb's likeness on the wall, and in front of it, this massive bronze that's hanging down. And so this kind of allusion to the fact that what Joseph Caleb was doing, who was involved in school lunch programs, free lunch school programs in Miami-Dade County. He was involved in bringing up the wages of workers. It's one of the reasons why he got assassinated. Too much too soon. And so that Richard believed that was a connection to a higher power, that he was being influenced, and of course it's referenced as ascension after death, much in, we see even all the way until the last decade, where we see the creation of the Emmett Till Monument referencing that ascension again. So these themes are recurrent through his life, and I encourage you to go see. They just did a $30 million restoration of the community center in Miami in 2019. So it's a beautiful space and mural to see.
Yeah, maybe just to close, we should mention that Richard Hunt made 160 public sculptures. The most for any American artist to date. And I think when you make 160 sculptures, you start creating landscapes of some sort. So if you go to Chicago, it's not like there's 9, there's like a Richard Hunt trail or something that travels through American history too. So there's something, I think, unlike perhaps many artists who think of public commissions as just a big version of what they do in the studio. I think his was much more committed to the dynamics of the neighborhoods, to how one related to the other. I remember, John, you took me to a sculpture in Chicago that is dedicated to Martin Luther King, and it's actually two sculptures, and they're in different sides of the block. So somehow they absorb the building between them because it has a long running hallway
From here to there.
Yeah, from here to there. And then it's for health, social health. So all this gets embroiled. So it's not like a thing plopped somewhere. It's like something woven into dynamics of the neighborhood and things like that. So maybe just to close, maybe we could talk about this public dimension, which we started with, right? With the Obama Commission. So take it away, panelists.
As far as, I mean, the fascination with Richard, obviously, like I said, he was making things all the time and a variety of scales, but the public work was obviously a strong string of getting the work out there. I mean, the expectation that if you make it, something smaller, it winds up in a white room, and there's a certain expectation of who goes into those white rooms to see the work. But you put a sculpture out on the sidewalk in a roundabout in front of a large building, it engages with everyone. It forces them, whether they like it or not, to engage. And he always found that great freedom to get a true response from every aspects of the community. And he always talked about greatly of that interaction and the unexpected nature of what those insights would be from the people walking by the sculptures.
I did actually want to speak to the idea of freedom itself. There is the importance of art that lives freely in the public. At the same time, I believe strongly that Richard's work belongs in collectors' homes, it belongs in museums, it belongs in galleries. But there's something about the freeing sensibility of the art itself. And then the importance of freedom to Richard as an artist. He believes so strongly in the ability to work freely, regardless of whatever marketplace pressures there may be, whatever political volatility was happening around him. He believed in his ability to work freely without the pressure of those forces on him, even though he was able simultaneously to speak back to those forces. And I think that's why I really love the title of the show, Pressure, because we see kind of the tensile strength of the material that he worked in, the resilience that is therefore embedded in these pieces as it speaks back dialectically to the history that Richard was articulating through these abstract works. But it is also about his refusal of certain pressures. And I think there's something very powerful in that. It's such a strong message that he was articulating in his own very low-key, very quiet way, which I think is remarkable. It goes back to his kind of monkish sensibility in the studio and his absolute commitment and dedication to the work itself.
Yeah, and his focus on freedom above all else is encapsulated in this great quote where he says, I'm not a black artist, I'm an artist who is black. It was very important for him to put the word artist ahead of any other qualifier. I think of, Georgia O'Keeffe saying, I'm sick of being told I'm the best woman painter. Why the qualifier, right? And he saw his art much in the same way. And talking about that public sphere, I mean, this piece right here was a public piece dedicated to Mary McLeod Bethune, co-founder of the NAACP, installed in Washington, D.C., just a few blocks from her home. This was almost divine figure in his household. He was. I asked him once the Bernard Pivot questionnaire, where you say, if you wanted to see someone on U.S. currency, whose figure would you suggest? And he said Mary McLeod Bethune, who really, back to Bookbird, believed education was the route for African Americans. And you see, of course, at Howard University, Friedman's column referencing the Freedmen's Bureau, right, which is all about educating illiterate slaves. And so this achieving freedom through education just, resounds over and over again. Even the title, From the Ground Up, referenced the school that she established in Daytona, in Florida, another Florida reference for everybody out there, for the locals. which she had, created a school with her children and a few other children. They had used crates for desks. They'd used blackberries for the ink and charcoal for the pencils. And that's how she started that school. That school ended up becoming Bethune-Cookman University. And that's about as from the ground up as you can possibly get, believing in education, believing in the African-American community in this country to be able to overcome. And so there's really a divine poetry in seeing Hero's Head of Emmett Till in 1956, and then seeing the very first sculpture going into the Obama Presidential Center for the first African-American president of the United States. It's incredible.
The complexity of trying to be at the forefront of your medium and at the same time trying to be true to social realities that you live is a very complex process. And not many artists of his generation pulled it off very well, or as well as he did, I would say. Yep. Super.